This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Well, the Eyes on the Prize film really describes the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and I think that it puts a wonderful context for understanding the impact of the Black Panther Party and some of the reasons for its demise in the late 1960s. One of the best accounts of both the rise and the fall of the Black Panther Party is A Taste of Power by Elaine Brown. And we're very privileged to have Elaine Brown with us today to talk about the legacy of the Black Panther Party. And I'd like to just kind of add that Elaine has, over the years, been a great friend for myself and for the King Papers Project and now the King Institute here. She's come here a number of occasions, even sang. I remember that you did a recording of Black Panther songs back in the 60s, and so a multi-talented person who is still doing a great deal. And I don't want to take up very much more of her time, but just welcome Elaine Brown back to campus.
Thank you very much. And of course, I have to start out by by acknowledging my sister, my friend, as I like to say, the first person who was my captain in the Black Panther Party. We did have a paramilitary structure. And at that time, we had women and men sort of in LA. We had sort of divided, not divided, but so she was the captain of the women when I joined the Black Panther Party. Woman after whom I named my own daughter, Ericka Huggins, is also here, and I understand going to talk to you, come back next week. So I'm very, very honored to, a couple of weeks. And I'm very honored to be here with her. Well, that actually makes me a lot more nervous, but that's all right. That's just, I won't be nervous long. So I think that within the framework of the limited time that we have, you know, it's one thing to talk about one's personal experiences in the Black Panther Party or the Black Panther Party from a personal perspective, which is what a lot of people do. And we tend to want to study history or at least get an approach to history through people's personal vignettes. And that isn't always the best way to understand the larger movement. The Black Panther Party actually officially ended in 1980. Do we say 1980, 81, something like that?
82, maybe.
Oh, okay. I was like waiting for the nod. So, excuse me. And of course, started in 1966. And I think the first thing that anybody has to do is to contextualize why there was a Black Panther Party in the first place. Because if we don't do that, then we sort of think this is some sort of a group that just grew up out of nowhere. Was it a part of the civil rights movement? And was the civil rights movement itself even a civil rights movement? Like, was there some finite place where, well, we all thought of ourselves as fighting for freedom, and it was really the freedom movement that we were all a part of, not the civil rights movement, because we can recall very well, and I certainly, Dr. Carson can recall very well that Dr. King in 1967 talks about where do we go from here. And by that time, you had the 64 and 65 Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts passed, and he recognized that, yes, we had gained something one might call civil rights, meaning that we now had our citizenship was secure after 100 years, was clear, but that there was something missing. And King essentially says that for Black people, we have half of what is good in America and double of what is bad. And so we have to continue the struggle to gain those human rights that we actually don't have and toward our freedom. And so, of course, King leads by 1968, at the time of his assassination, leads a very dangerous moment of the March on Washington, talking about the Poor People's Campaign. Because when we think of Dr. King, most of us just think he was a good man, had a dream, don't know what the dream was, some black and white children walking up the mountain holding hands, something we don't remember. And so, you know, it's like, what was the dream? Well, it wasn't to get the 64 Civil Rights Act passed and the 65 Voting Rights Act. That was more like Lyndon Johnson's dream, to shut down the movement. But Dr. King came back with a very heavy-duty statement that we needed something more, talking about our human rights in very specific terms, in terms of our health health care, free health care, or ultimately talking about the redistribution of the wealth of the nation, which most people forget that Dr. King did call for by 68, just before he was assassinated. So I say that to say that the context of the Black Panther Party is the same context. As a matter of fact, Henry Louis Gates at one point said that Dr. King had become more of a Black Panther than anything else by the end of his life. And so we have to know, what did that mean? So in order to contextualize it, we just have to know that the Black Panther Party identified, as other people did, that the issue that Black people were confronted with was a question of freedom, not a question of civil rights or rights under the law, but a question of freedom. Because if we were to look back through the laws of this country, by the time the country was formed in 1776, we know that this was a slave holding nation that was founded in 1776. It was illegal to own slavery. It was legal. Not only was it legal, it was illegal to try to be free if you were a slave. It was illegal for blacks to try to be free. So when we talk about civil rights, it's kind of bizarre when we don't recognize that the law shifts, and when it shifts, you become a criminal if you don't conform to the laws. But the laws are dictated by those people who are in power. So those people who created this country in 1776 and the flag of this country and all the other things that we like to think about, the Constitution and all the architects of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, almost all of them, especially Jefferson, slaveholders themselves, and slavery was in fact legal. And there was basically one group of people in the slave class, and it was a class, a laboring class, and those were captive Africans and our descendants. Now that's important to note, because when the country is formed, we have Black people existing as a slave class in the United States of America, and it was legal to have slaves and illegal to help slaves to not be slaves. If you were a white and you were trying to help people on the whatever little networks were beginning to come into play, it was illegal to assist anyone to be free. So once we contextualize it, then we realize when we go forward to 1865 and the 13th Amendment, that 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was checked by the Black codes, of course. Black codes were codes that dictated life for Black people in the southern states, but they certainly radiated out to all the other states of the Union. And so effectively, Blacks went from being a slave class to a criminal class, because the biggest crime under the Black codes that you could commit was what? To be vagrant, to not have a job. I don't know how you can have a job. Yesterday you were a slave, today you're allegedly free. So we effectively went from being slaves to sort of semi-slaves, partial slaves. No 40 acres, the General Sherman's field order number 15 that we talk about, the 40 acres distribution of land to all slave families, that sort of died within a year, and under the new President Johnson. And by the time you get the 14th and 15th Amendments passed, you have a group of people basically living either in the jail or as on the chain gang because they violated the law of not having a job, or sharecropping. But there's been no real, there's been no evidence, no manifestation of anything that could possibly be called freedom. Our condition effectively didn't change. 1896, of course, Plessy versus Ferguson ultimately just stated, yes, I mean, this is the situation of Black people, and as long that your citizenship does not go to your status necessarily, because we can't make white people like you. You have certain rights, but we can't force everybody to do this. And so as Plessy could not sit on the train in 1896 and sued and went the state of Louisiana for having to be sitting in a segregated inferior car for the same price, this court said as long as the accommodations are equal, they can be separate, which of course gave us Jim Crow America and the rise of American apartheid, or discrimination and so forth. So we fought for those next years from 1896, Booker T. Washington talking about the separation, and that was fine, the separation of races, as long as we had some money. And everybody started pouring money into the Tuskegee machine. Marcus Garvey, who arrives from Jamaica, says, that's right, we need an independent economy. And then we go to, the Niagara movement and the Du Bois people talking about the integration, the education of the Negro and so forth and so on, and how we all need, but everybody was looking for one thing, and that was how we're going to eat and live and have food and clothing and housing and medical care and all those things that we need as human beings to survive, to determine our destinies, to define ourselves and be in charge of our lives. So by the time you get to 1954 with little Linda Brown, who says, look, it's not working in the school system, separate is not equal. And so you get the desegregation orders and so forth coming down, the various court rulings out of the Brown versus Board of Education, everybody scrambling to try to get into school. You know, when people say that Black people don't like to be educated, we forget that their blood was shed every single day almost when black folks went to try to get an education, thinking that might be a key to getting food, clothing, housing, medical care, and so forth. And by the time you get to 55, and the great moment that we all know of Rosa Parks, who does what Plessy did in 1896 and 1955, said, I paid my money, I want to get on the bus. I don't own the bus, don't own anything else, but I do want a seat on the bus, you know, and so I can go to work and clean somebody's houses and so forth. And of course, that became the great boycott, but gives us the moral voice of Dr. King rising up out of that boycott and kept telling America that shame on you, and that something different has to happen. And by the time we get to 64, 65, the Civil Rights Acts, we've been 100 years since the 13th Amendment, and all we achieved was the right to vote, maybe, if you could get past some guns, and the right to use public toilets and drink out of public fountains with white people. We didn't have any money, we didn't have any land, we didn't have any housing, we were discriminated against at every turn. We had gotten past a certain period of lynching and so forth, but there was still brutality. And so when the Black Panther Party comes into this, it comes in talking about the reason that the Black Panther Party is here is to talk about the liberation of black people. Of course, there were this language was going around, like Black Power, and nobody knew what Black Power was, but we just felt like, we don't know what it is, but we want it. And so we strove to create a new ideal, an ideology that went not to the question of equal rights with white people, but our human rights as human beings, which is a little bit different. Because see, when we move forward and we find like women taking this cause up and other people, you can ultimately play this out to say that, well, Condoleezza Rice is an ultimate achievement as a black woman and a black and a woman, and we would argue with that because that means that you have now gained the right to be equal with men to oppress other people, and that would be what we would oppose, because we then said in order for black people to be free, we have to find strategies for freedom, and we began to talk about we had a 10-point platform and program, and we discussed that program and started with the 7th point, which is to end police brutality in our cities, because in our communities, because that was the first point of our relationship with the system, where we were charged, convicted, and a sentence executed on the streets. Huey Newton used to call it a red light trial, right there at the light, right now. And so so you see the police and so forth. So all these things were going on, and so the Black Panther Party identified 10 points, and our ultimate goal was we talked about, we wanted land, bread, housing, clothing, education, justice, and peace. And we had other goals too, but the bottom line was we wanted to have self-determination. We wanted an education that taught us our true history and so forth and so on. And so those points became a kind of basis for the party's existence. And the party was saying something different than every other group around at the time, and that was that we were talking about black liberation. We were talking about self-determination, but we also recognized that we could not talk about black liberation or self-determination in the context of the oppression of other people. We couldn't talk about it in the context of the oppression of Native people, so we helped to form a coalition with the American Indian Movement, AIM. How can we talk about our freedom in the context of the oppression of Chicanos or Mexicans? And so we formed a coalition with the Brown Berets. Same thing with Puerto Ricans and the Young Lords, poor whites in the Young Patriot Party. What about women? We were the only organization calling for women's liberation as a part of our struggle. What about gays? We were the only organization talking about gay liberation as a part of our struggle. What about people who have disabilities and a handicap? We formed a coalition with the Center for Independent Living over in Berkeley, and certainly we're pioneering in getting the federal buildings to break down the doors and begin to be wheelchair accessible. What about the elderly? We helped to form a group with other people called the Great Panther Organization. And what about our brothers and sisters fighting all around the world? And we had coalitions in Africa with the PAC in South Africa, and with the ZANU in Zimbabwe, and with Frelimo in Mozambique and so forth. And our brothers and sisters, and we coalesced with our brothers and sisters in struggling in Vietnam. As a matter of fact, not only did we call for peace in Vietnam, we not only called for peace, we called for victory for the Viet Cong. Not only did we call for victory for the Viet Cong, we said we would send our people there to fight with the Viet Cong against the imperial, as we said, American force. So we considered ourselves to be revolutionaries because we said we could not be free in the context of the existing scheme, because it is that scheme that gave rise to our oppression. So how can we continue that scheme and then consider ourselves to be free under that same scheme? So in order for us to talk about freedom, the whole thing had to change. ultimately, we were certainly anti-capitalist, but that wasn't any different than what Dr. King was talking about. When you're talking about the redistribution of the wealth, somebody's going to shoot you in the throat because nobody wants to hear anything about the redistribution of the wealth. That's when you get to the fundamental questions, okay? Fundamental questions. So the party did that, and we had many strategies to do that. And people like me came in because we were swept up in the moment. It was a wonderful and exciting moment, and we're transformed, not only then but now. My own life is defined by the Black Panther Party and my participation in the party as an individual. I can't even imagine myself outside of that history because of the fact that it had so much to do with the history of this country and the efforts of our people, Black people, to be free. So I think that just looking at the arc that I've just sort of tried to quickly explain, what we attempted to do was to create the conditions to bring about revolutionary change in the United States of America toward a society in which no one would be hungry, no one would be exploited, no one would be oppressed, and a dream about something bigger and different and better and a new society, and to do that. And why we were crushed, of course, was because we did make all these coalitions, because we did influence so many people, and because we were bringing about mind changes among Black people and other poor people that they had a right to eat, they had a right to have food. Nobody should be denying anyone food because you don't have the money. If you don't have any money in this country, you can't eat. It's just that simple. That means you could drop dead tomorrow. If you don't have it, you know. Most people in this room probably don't have medical insurance, or you have it through your parents, or you have it through some other little program. But if you don't have it, or maybe you have it, and you say, well, I can get my teeth fixed, but I can't get caps, or I can't get root canals. People start making choices about their lives based on health. And so we find today, just to close this out, that we have similar conditions, if not worse in many ways, for the majority of Black people, and certainly for a number of other groups of people. We see the so-called immigrant question, which is not really an immigration question because it's a Mexican question. Nobody's asking about French immigrants. Nobody's asking about any German immigrants. No Lithuanians are being challenged. Everybody's talking about some Mexicans, so let's talk about what it is. And it really is about money, of course. It's not about Mexicans, it's about money. It's about getting cheap labor over here, people striving to make money, and some other people talking about whether or not their legal status, which is legal immigrants, which is hysterical when one thinks about the very founding of this country. And there were some native people here for 10,000 years or so, and people came in and ripped them off and killed them and everything else. With a certain amount of a level of brutality that probably hasn't been seen in a long time, and now having the nerve enough to talk about who is legal and who isn't legal. We have over 2 million people in prison in the United States, the highest incarceration rate in the world, and of those 2 million people, 50% are Black. And we have Black poverty at levels at just about the same percentage and ratios as it existed in the 60s. And we have situations where the Black infant mortality rate, for example, is the exact same as it was when Dr. King talked about it in '67 or so, and which was double that of white infant mortality, higher than almost any other place in the Western Hemisphere. So how do these conditions come about? Well, because we haven't really resolved the issues that the Black Panther Party addressed. We have not talked really about freedom. We all think we're free, especially people sitting on some of the college campuses that I talk to, where people have a tendency to think that, well, at this point, what's the problem? You know what I'm saying? And it's amazing to me how many Black people, students especially, will ask me this question. And I always say, well, people have said, well, I know what the problem was in your day. What's the problem today? As though having a leased Lexus and a credit card is some sort of a notion that you are free. I don't know what you're paying to go to school here. Is it over $45,000, $50,000? So if you don't have $45,000, $50,000, you just can't go to school here unless you get a scholarship, and that's even more rare. Or you can piece together a loan program, which is what most people do. Very few people coming here on cash. You know what I'm saying? Some do, but very few. Most people have a little program going. So that means that the majority of people in this country really can't go to these big universities. And that means that we're not prepared even to offer people the opportunity to learn unless you have the price to pay and the ticket to get in. And so things do need to change. And I think what the Black Panther Party's legacy is an examination of the concrete conditions and what we want to do, if anything, to make any kind of changes in the society. We talk about crime, we talk about gangs, we talk about all this other stuff, and whether or not IMUS really was supposedly talking about whether this was a rap problem or a language problem or what was it, well, it was just a problem of a racist that should have been shut down much faster than he was, and maybe in different ways, but that's opinion there. But what we can learn from the Black Panther Party is how to look at and examine the conditions that we're living under and whether or not this is the society that we want. And if it is not the society that we want, and I think that we don't want to really have a society where a lot of people are hungry, we don't want to have a society where a lot of children don't even have a place to stay and they're staying in juvenile jails just so they can live somewhere. We don't really want to have a society where we have one of the worst education systems in the country, in the world. And we don't really want to have a society that is constantly going to war and fighting and murdering people all around the world in our name and for oil. And we know all those reasons now, at least we should know. Then if we don't want that, the legacy, I think, of the party is to examine how we might go about changing that and what change has to be made and whether this change over here or that change over there will be sufficient and whether or not we might want to really end up talking about fundamental change in this social construct in the United States so that we might, as we used to say in the party, truly be able to bring about the power of the people. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll take some questions. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions. One is specific and one is really
Sure.
vague. So my specific question is, I wonder if you know anything about the Black Power movement in Australia, just because that's a thing I was researching.
Are you the young lady that sent me the email about that, or that sent me? Yeah. No, not very much. I mean, there were a number of people that, even we hear about Stephen Biko, and really he was inspired by the Black Panther Party of the United States, and many were. And of course, I think it's the Maori people, right? I know Aaron Dixon, one of the brothers who was a leader of one of our chapters in Washington State, has visited with them and has had some communication, but this is post the Black Panther Party. I don't recall, I don't know, Ericka, if you recall any particular thing that we had in relationship to the Maori people in Australia, but I know many groups, believe it or not, around the world, as people began singing, "We Shall Overcome," coming out of Dr. King, there were groups of people around the world that formed themselves and patterned themselves after the Black Panther Party in terms of identifying themselves as Black people and also as having human rights. So that's why I didn't have very much to say to you, because I really didn't know much of what to say.
Well, my other question is, what can we do now, today, as students? What can we do?
Well, the first thing to do is to decide that there's something that needs to be fixed. I mean, if everybody's comfortable, then what can we say? And so, I was speaking to some students at UCLA the other day, and for Black students, I always say, well, you got here by the blood. You didn't get here because you had a high SAT or you didn't have a high SAT or affirmative action, because the only affirmative action was affirmative action that we created, okay? Was not a benevolent, even though, what's his name, the twin that always says that the white people, huh? She knew. Just what I was talking about, the twin. The good twin and the bad twin, right? Shelby, the bad twin, the evil twin for real, who suggests that affirmative action was a result of the benevolence of whites. But affirmative action, the little bit of programming that there has been, is because we have fought and we have struggled and so forth. I mean, I always say that, Fannie Lou Hamer lost her eyes so you could go to school here at Stanford University. That's the way I, sort of juxtapose the facts of things. So in that case, then we have to say, okay, what is our duty at this point? Do we have any duty as Blacks, just using Blacks alone? Or do we as enlightened people, if we are enlightened, understand that, I am connected to you, as we used to use the African phrase, I am we. And so we say, I am connected to you. So if there is some child out there who is hungry, then do I have any duty to that child? And people say, well, the parents are no good, the mother's no good, the father's no good, and all that kind of stuff. And so therefore, that I can shrug, like Atlas shrugged, like Ayn Rand's ideal. I can shrug and say, I'm not responsible for that, so therefore I'm not responsible to fix it. I didn't bring it about. Let the parents do it. I wrote a book about a little boy named Little B, Michael Lewis, called The Condemnation of Little B, and his mother was a crack addict and a prostitute for the crack, although he likes to say that his mother never prostituted herself, but that would mean for money. But for crack, she did a few things that were necessary to survive. And by the time he was 8 years old, his house was the crack house. Now somebody will say, well, why didn't he go to school? He had choices to make, He should have sat down and done his homework. And we have all these kind of notions that I'm not, this is the way we think, That way I'm not responsible for him. But here in the Palo Alto area, we had a chapter, a branch in this area in East Palo Alto, and we had a lot of Stanford students. Matter of fact, Stanford students took over our breakfast program here, which was a relief to us, free breakfast for children program, because then we didn't have to do it. And they had a lot, and some of them had a lot of money, and they supported it. One of them ended up helping us with our school over in East Oakland, building our little science center, and taking some of that $3,000 a month that he had for spending change in 1972. He was a cash and carry student at Stanford, and his sister. But anyway, of course, they did own most of Austin, but that's another story. But the point is that students did that. So yesterday I was at, where was I? UC Santa Cruz, right? And they had a big people of color conference. And it was actually quite incredible to see the blend and the mix. There were like, I'd say 300 people who stuck to the conference the whole time. And they were really Black, Latino, Native, so forth and so on. And it was a wonderful Asian. It was wonderful to see them. And they kept saying, what can we do? And I said, didn't you have Watsonville sitting right out here 12 miles away, where you have all these Mexicans picking strawberries? Meanwhile, the INS comes through when they want to, in other words, how the game gets played is like the Driscoll strawberry people who own Watsonville have the people coming and picking, and then they're planting right now. I think there's a planting period now, and then they're going to pick till, like, say, August or something. And then they're kind of like out of work for a while. And that's when you want to round them up and get a few out so you can even go lower on the money on the next round of people. I said, now you're sitting here on this beautiful UC Santa Cruz campus where you have everything they had dormitories. I thought I was in Beverly Hills. You know what I mean? Truly. The dormitories at UC Santa Cruz are almost incredible, and the rolling hills of Santa Cruz, just beautiful. I said, why don't you go out there to some of those kids that are out there in Watsonville, and you don't have to do what we did, but you might want to do something. A lot of this beautiful campus is not even being used during the summer. Why don't you let it be a camp for some children of the farm workers who don't have anything to do with their children for the summer? And everybody went, yeah, wow, we could do that. I said, look at this campus. You got food, you got swimming pools, you got these people saying, oh, look, we have lavender here. And they dealing with the strawberry fields of Watsonville, which is like the cotton fields of Georgia, and they're telling me about the lavender on the campus, walking around with some rings in their noses and some blue hair, thinking that they're radical because they're now dreaded out or, whacked out with some kind of a look, you know what I'm trying to say? And that meanwhile, back at the Watsonville Ranch, folks are dying. So you got East Palo Alto, you got some immediate things that could be done as students to say, I am connected. I am connected to other human beings, and I want to use my skills. If I want to become a doctor, I'm going to think, okay, I do want to make some money because I got to pay medical malpractice insurance, if nothing else. So maybe I could be a doctor and start a little clinic somewhere, as we did for free, for free. If I'm going to be a teacher, maybe I'll make a commitment to teach in elementary school where it's hard and there's no money. And as a matter of fact, you probably had to pay more money to help students because there's very little budgeting and so forth, or maybe fight for education. And if you want to do that, you can take your skills and begin to think differently about it. And then eventually maybe you'll do what I did and what most of us did. You learn from a little thing, and then that little thing sort of says, wait a minute, I can't just have a breakfast program, or, maybe I have to do something else, and maybe some other people. And the best way is for people to unite and to organize, because the Black Panther Party was an organization, and outside of that, most of us are walking wounded in many ways because we don't have that framework to operate in anymore. So that's kind of long. Yes.
You talk about a number of progressive causes that the Black Panther Party undertook when you were in power. But what about gender equality, right? Because you speak about sexism in your book, and I know Alice Walker wrote an article in the New York Times in 1993 sort of related to your book, sort of criticizing the way that you were treated as a woman in power within the organization.
I wrote a parallel article too. Did you see it?
I think I did.
Yeah, well, that's the important part, because we wouldn't let that article go out without our article, because Alice Walker wasn't a member of the Black Panther Party, so it was very hard for her to comment. I mean, I've heard somebody else tell me, I've forgotten who it was, a poet, well-known poet, a woman, and who said, the Black Panther Party is this. Well, I mean, I don't know how you can comment on the Black Panther Party when you weren't even in the Black Panther Party. I mean, you can comment on it, but it's not coming from any information, because it's not like there have been big documents. But sexism is, that's an interesting word. What we sought as ideologically or ideally was women's liberation, okay, and meaning the end of oppression and exploitation of women. Now, within the party, we weren't the NACP, we weren't 100 years old. I joined the party in 1968. The chapter started in early 68, end of 67. So I mean, our chapter, the leaders of our chapter, including the husband of Ericka Huggins, were murdered in January of 69. So our little chapter was formed, and it existed for a year before the two main leaders were murdered, assassinated at UCLA. So you have to contextualize that to understand we didn't have time to sit around and say, well, let's talk about the role of women in the Black Panther Party. The role of women when I came in is she was a captain. Now, she was a captain of the women, but we changed that and you were still a captain. You know what I'm saying? So we didn't say that. Now, this isn't to say we didn't have chauvinism, so I'm not going there. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I just wanted you to see that we had just come into being. We weren't institutionalized like the NACP with a 100-year history and have time, and we didn't see ourselves as having time to always discuss some of these things. And then we were being beset by the police very quickly in the early formations once Huey Newton was arrested. I mean, as the party's chapters expanded, we were also suffering day-to-day kinds of things and trying to move our agenda. And so internal questions and cultural relationships and how we were, we definitely knew, we as women, we thought of ourselves as comrades, as sisters, and we thought of ourselves as revolutionaries. Now, did the brothers and some of the sisters think of us as inferior beings because we were women? Of course. Where were we going to get revolutionary brothers from revolutionary heaven? They came out the streets of America, just like everybody else. They had the same history to undo. You know what I'm saying? They had to rethink themselves. But I'll tell you a great story about John Huggins when we were all living over on Century Boulevard, and there was a guy in the party who we were living collectively all the time, you know, and, you know, when we had these titles, like people like, oh, you're the deputy minister, or you're whatever, but we were sleeping on floors most of the time, just so the title was, you know, wasn't commensurate with like a better living standard all the time. So anyway, we were sleeping on the floor there in the basement, and I was one of the people down there, and in my sleeping bag, and one of the brothers tried to get into the sleeping bag and put his hands on me, and I didn't know what I should say because like, if I say this, what will happen? You know, it's like, what are the rules about this? Well, we didn't have any rules. And so I went to John and I said, John, what should I, you know, this guy did this and what should I do? And he says, just a minute, I'll be right back. And he says, what you should do is this. Here, he said, here, take this. And it was a little hatchet. He said, sleep with this. Can I tell you about what the hatchet does to the average guy that's thinking about getting into? It has there's a quick response. You know, a hatchet, you know what I'm saying? And so I slept with that hatchet, and it never happened again. And I just had it in my hand at all times when I'm not making this story up, this is a true story. And that guy, you know, backed away. So there was that kind of thing. And we found that through practice, that also changed our roles and our relationships. Every sister, everybody in the party, once we started the breakfast programs, you had to work in the breakfast program if you were assigned to. So I don't care if you thought you were a macho man or not, you're going to be in there flipping some pancakes or something and serving breakfast. And everybody had to be trained on weapons. And so women were trained and women were strapped. That changes the dynamic too, you know what I'm saying, when you have women who have guns. You know, the whole, well, it does, I'm just telling you. And so people begin to rethink, well, what is the role? The role of the revolutionary is what? So now it becomes the role of the revolutionary, role of comrade. We have people who would say comrade. We call each other sometimes comrade sister, comrade brother. Some people would say it with a nasty tone. People held on to things. We attempted, in the context of everything else we were doing. But I think that one of the things we did find, if we were to look back on the party now, I believe that the action and the roles became defined more by our commitment to our work. Were there chauvinists in the party who were brutal? People got beaten up? Of course. Some of those people suffered some very serious consequences later on as we began to evolve. And so we had to put out statements. You cannot beat up your woman. We had to actually have rules like this because even though that might seem like that should be obvious, it wasn't always obvious. You know, I remember a brother beating up a teacher at our school. She's coming in and with sunglasses, like, wait a minute, you beat her up? Oh, because she didn't cook your greens correctly. And we had stuff like that. We had to actually root this behavior out. Now, you guys think, well, nobody would ever do that. But then most of us, if we were to tell our personal stories, I'm sure there's some women in this room who've been molested, but they haven't talked about that lately. I had a daughter who was raped at 15 and didn't tell me until she was 32 or 3. So there's some stories about how men treat women that people haven't actually talked about today, because this is a patriarchy, and every society in the world right now is a patriarchy, which means that men are more valued than women in the notion. And now, black men would say in those days, you had a lot of black people would say, excuse me, they would say things like, well, you know, black power, that's a man's thing, you know, black liberation. We had everything going on. But when we look at the NAACP, the more milder, you know, groups, or the SCLC, they never had any women, or SNCC, never had any women in leadership. We had women in leadership. And so I think that that's another statement to look at and to think about when we think, like, you know, some of the other groups, well, these are some macho, crazy, thug, you know, kind of guys, and that's kind of the image of the Black Panther male. John Huggins was no thug. I don't say he wasn't tough. He wasn't a thug. He wasn't in a gang that I know. Was there a gang in New Haven that he was in? I can't imagine John in a gang. But anyway, so my point is that we did examine this question as best we could. We have political education classes. And then I'll tell you one last thing that we did. And I'm so sorry I never put it in this book, because it's one of the best parts, one of the best things that Huey did. And I don't know, it was just a funny moment in history. You might have been in prison at this time, but we had required reading, you know, Marx, you know, Mao. We also might read Nietzsche. We might read any philosopher, any idea, you know, whatever. And these were for our political education. You know, we call it political education classes. And so at one point, one of the books we read was called The Height Report. Anybody ever heard of The Height Report? That's because you and I are, you know, we remember the Height Report. For those younger people here, the Height Report was a survey of several thousand women by a psychologist named Cher Hite, a behavioral psychologist, I guess, Cher Hite, H-I-T-E, and she put out a report, and it became known as the Height Report, and it was about women's sexuality. And one of the things, and you know, it was a pretty big tome, you know, and she had surveyed all these women about what they did, what they didn't do, what they liked, and so forth. And then she found that across class, race, everything, age, there were the most common things about women and sexuality that people didn't know. Now remember, for those of you here, this might be like, are you kidding? But for that moment, it was the shakabuku, wasn't it? She said, first of all, that women faked orgasm. And people were like, what? You know? I know you didn't. And these hardcore brothers in the party, they were like, oh, no, I know what I did last night. You know, no, hell no, okay. And so we did a poll within the party, and there were women who said things like, well, I'm sorry to tell you, it was never good. You know, stuff like this. So, but look at it like this. I liked you so much, I let you think that because I wanted you to be happy, honey. So, comrade, brother, you know. And the second thing, and Huey made us study this now, and these brothers had to examine themselves. And the second thing was that women masturbated. Well, that was like the biggest shock in the world, because men were like, what do you mean? Are you telling me that it's possible for you to reach a certain place without me or anything? And that was a big shakabuku, okay? So I say that to say that men had to deal with some of those things. I saw men in one of those classes in Oakland literally cry because of, yes, I'm sorry. So when you got down to the nitty and the gritty of it, you know, but one of the things we did is we weren't afraid to talk about some things. That's what I'm saying. And that, I think, was the good news. But we, in the same breath, understood that we were comrades, that we were in a struggle together, that no bullet was going to pass my head because I was a woman, you know, that I didn't owe you anything because you were a man, like my body. Because, you know, we had brothers in the early days would say, I would like for you to be my Pantherette. I was like always thinking, is that something like something you put in your hair? I could only think of like a barrette, you know. So, I mean, yes, it was ridiculous. But I think that we had some pretty tough broads in the party. Some people were run out of the party because of it. We had women like Ericka and me and Phyllis Jackson and Joan Kelly and all the people that we could talk about, just a number of women who stood strong. And we did not let these men roll over us. And we did challenge them. And it was rough, and some of us got beaten up, and some of us beat up a few folks after they thought they could beat up other folks. So it got rough, but we challenged each other, and we didn't stop. So yes, we had chauvinism, but I don't know if I would say a sexism only because I'm not sure, you know, what that word really translates out into in a certain way. But that's a good, I know it took a long time, but it's kind of interesting to know about the height report. Yeah. Any other?
Just to follow up on that question, you became chair of the party.
Right, chairman actually, chairman.
And how did you run a party of very
Macho
strong
guys, right? Because as I say in my opening lines, I had all the guns and all the money, which means that I was talking about this last night with somebody about they were talking about the brown berets, a young version of the brown berets, and they were talking about, well, how did the women do this and how did you do that? And I said, well, because I had some brothers that was strapped all the time behind me. I had a bodyguard. I had, you know, people were disciplined in the Black Panther Party. I mean, it was a paramilitary structure to the degree that orders, as we used to say, orders come from the top down, ideas can flow up and down the chain of command, but there was a chain of command and people respected it. If they didn't respect it, I would have never been able to last 10 minutes. If Huey Newton hadn't said, this is who I now designate as the chairman of the party, and people either supported that or they didn't. Now, I wasn't sure at the beginning who was going to be supportive or not, but as it turns out, we did have some pretty tough guys who stayed with the party, not with me, Elaine, but because this was the party structure, they accepted it. Sometime later, some of them began to challenge it, but they were able to be put down because I had, you know, it's like Aristide. I mean, it's not like Aristide, but I want to use Aristide, you know, from Haiti, okay? So Aristide says, I'm going to become president, but I don't need an army. I'm like, see ya. Wonder how long he's going to last, you know? So, and he didn't last long. Colin Powell went and slapped him upside the head and said, best thing for you to do is get out of office, even though you were democratically elected and all that other stuff. Same thing with Allende in Chile. You know, he has the very person at the head of his army is trained at the School of the Americas in Georgia, Pinochet. Now, this is not a good guy to have for your general. You need a general that's got your back. That's the minimum, okay? That's the minimum. And so there were people there, brothers, who were serious, and just like the women, but I can tell you that without those soldiers in that level, there would have been some conflict. And there were people who challenged it wasn't that they challenged me personally, but they thought it would have been an easier thing to roll over me and take charge. Some people from LA that came up and thought they were going to do that, and they were put down pretty ruthlessly, quite frankly. And so I don't know if any of you have been looking at these American Gangster series on television, not the film version with Denzel Washington, but the last one, the Frank Lucas story was one thing, but there was another one called about Felix Mitchell, who was out of Oakland. Felix Mitchell was one of the biggest and one of the early big-time drug dealers in Oakland. And one of the things that Huey had started, and I've said this in my book, so it's not something that, you know, and Flores Forbes says it in his book, which you might want to read, called Will You Die With Me? Forbes, F-O-R-B-E-S, is the name of the author, last name. And we, at one point, you know, we had fundraising parties. We did a lot of things to raise money so we could keep our school going, keep our programs going, so forth and so on. And at one point, we began to, what Huey called, collect tithes from the illegitimate black capitalists. That would be your dope dealers, your pimps, and so forth. They were operating in Oakland. Huey decided that they would have to tithe so they could participate in the struggle, even though they clearly didn't seem to want to. And many of them did resist. And one of them was Felix Mitchell, one of the big dope dealers in East Oakland. And we talked, and Flores Forbes, I don't know if you saw that, Ericka, Flores Forbes is actually in that film. I didn't know about it until somebody called me about it.
My younger son called me to tell me, and I missed it.
I did too, but we're gonna get copies of it. But Flores, I called Flores, why didn't you tell me? But anyway, so, and Felix Mitchell was one of those people that we collected from. There would have been no way in the world that I could have survived that period in Oakland, the rise of that heavy-duty drug trade, without those men, period. And so they were behind us, and ultimately there were conflicts with the men and the women, but as far as most of them, they supported, even if they didn't like the idea of a woman being the head of the party, their commitment to the party was greater than their chauvinism, and so they stayed with it. And if they didn't, they just had to leave. the party, the city, and perhaps the state. We never know. Anything else? No? Yes.
I guess I'm not familiar with the Black Panther Party. So I guess my question is, how did the Black Panther Party interact with current government members and advocate for blacks and the poor? I mean, were they, like a lot of what you've been saying, I think, is more like an individual, a change in like the way the individual thinks about themselves. I mean, what was the Black Panther Party doing to, change the way that people in power are thinking?
Well, we, as I indicated, I tried to avoid the individual. I thought I said that in the beginning, the individual issues, by talking about the context in which the Black Panther Party came into being, okay? And that was as a part of the freedom movement, right? And we organized different people around in coalitions, but mainly we focused on what we were doing in the black community. So I didn't address the question of getting people to participate, because we knew that the Black Panther Party was not going to be the agent for change. The agent for change, we always said, was the masses of people. Without the masses of people, there is no revolutionary struggle. So in order for us to achieve the goal of liberation and get to that point, we would have to then create the conditions for the masses of people to participate. We were the instigators of that. We were in the what we call vanguard of that movement as we saw it. And so in order to get people involved in the process, we developed a number of programs for people to talk about how you can think about your life. In other words, people say, well, why should we give these people food? But if people are hungry, they have a right to eat. That should be a human right. The right to eat should be a human right, and no government and no people should deny that to any other people. That was our position. But in order to say that, we did more than say it. We said, look, using the sort of ideal of Che Guevara as expressed by Che Guevara, that words are beautiful but actions are supreme. So we created initially the Free Breakfast for Children program. That had such an impact. As I mentioned, here in East Palo Alto, we had a wonderful Free Breakfast for Children program. But across the country, all of our chapters, at one point we were feeding over 100,000 people a day free breakfast. This instigated change within the public school system so that we now have free breakfast and lunch right now in all public school systems in America. Why? Because people demanded it. We said, okay, let's talk about just general free food. We started out by giving away 10,000 bags of groceries in Oakland with, as we said, a chicken in every bag, And we began by having also free clinics so that people would understand that you had a right to have health care, that a price shouldn't be put on your head or on your breast or on your prostate gland if you don't have the money to pay for treatment. And so we wanted to advocate for that. As to the government itself, we wanted to isolate the government so that the people would begin to challenge the government. The Black Panthers challenged the government. What does it mean? But the government actually ended up challenging the Black Panther Party from the FBI particularly, which identified us as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States in 1968. In other words, we were like the terrorists of America, according to J. Edgar Hoover. And so they put it on us, too. People, as you saw by Fred Hampton's murder, was clearly identified ultimately as being orchestrated by the FBI. Why would the FBI kill Fred Hampton, one would ask? What had he done? He created free clinic. They had one of the best clinics in our party was in Chicago and so forth. What had Fred Hampton done is that he had inspired and instigated a lot of people to get angry, not only blacks but whites, not only whites but Latinos. And as a matter of fact, Fred Hampton called for the creation of a revolutionary rainbow coalition, not to be confused with whatever that is Jesse Jackson is talking about. Calling for black power for black people, yellow power for yellow people, white power for white people, red power for red people, brown power for brown people. We said that. And we said we have to talk about everybody being able to have your rights as a human being. So that was the buildup of all of people challenging the government and the very existence of the government. As for the apparatus of the government, it came down on us with all hell. Our office in LA was assaulted by several hundred members of what was an unknown group then called the SWAT team, which was created for the Black Panther Party. The very first SWAT team in America was in Los Angeles, and it was created to put down the Black Panther Party. 11 people in our office, 2 women included, fought the police for 5.5 hours and survived it. But that was the kind of thing. People were arrested. Ericka Huggins spent 2 years in jail on a fake charge of conspiracy. And so that was the way the government responded to us. Our fight was to change the entire dynamic. And we didn't see ourselves as being the only ones in that. And so what our primary focus was the organizing of the people to be the agents for change. Are you following that?
Yeah, I guess my only other concern is, so it's not the governmental structure and like the actual laws in the Constitution that you disagree, or the Black Party is not trying to get rid of. It's sort of the values of the people in those positions?
No. The laws really reflect who is in charge. As I mentioned in the beginning, the people who formed this country, who signed the Constitution, were mostly slaveholders, okay? So therefore, slavery, it was in their interest to not disband slavery because too much money in slavery. South Carolina rice farmers alone by 1776 were challenging kings and queens of Western Europe in terms of the amount of money they had. Now, why is that important? Because, in other words, if I say this is the way the game is going to get played, okay, I come in here and I rob everybody, right? I just come in here with a couple people with some machine guns and say, give it up. 90% of you will do that. You know what I'm saying? Most of us, I mean, I will. If you come in here with a machine gun and want my purse, I mean, I might give them not only mine, but yours, you know? So that's the way that goes because I'm in charge now, and the law is what I say it is because I've got this. It's what I say it is. So I'm now going to say, okay, all of the women get on this side of the river and the men, I mean, whatever I say is what the law is because I'm now in power. So the laws reflect the reality. You understand? So when we say, for example, the constant shifting of law, we see that 1 minute the Supreme Court will say you have Roe versus Wade. That's a common one. That's an easy one. The law is that you can't have an abortion. Now the law is that you can legally have an abortion. What changed? Did the morality of abortion change? No. What changed was the law and the people who were able to influence that. But in this country, the fundamental scheme that we challenged was not the government, because the government was a reflection of Wall Street, of capitalism, of all the private corporations and the corporate people who held the power and therefore defined the law. They had the guns, they had the money, and they're going to say, this is what the law is today. And so, but the people, we said, were the true holders of power if they would be collective, because our interests are not served by people who will make us pay us $5 an hour. Here's a government that has what is it now? The minimum is what, $7 an hour or something? Who is living on $7 an hour? I'm gonna start selling some crack if I have to worry about $7 an hour. Although that is hard these days. It's hard out there in the trap to sell and make any money. But you see what I'm saying? I'm saying this humorously, but a new scheme, a new construct where we don't, for example, the government that Hillary Clinton talks about insurance, all health insurance for everybody, right? Right? Right. Okay. We're not talking about health insurance. She's trying to feed the insurance people right now, okay? But we don't see that because it sounds good to say universal health insurance. Well, if I'm sitting up here and I'm Providence Insurance Company, whatever it is, something with Providence is in it, the Lincoln Insurance Company, whatever it might be. Why can't I think of an insurance company right now? So it's going to be in my interest to have universal health care because everybody's going to have to buy health care. The government is not going to pay for it, not under the Hillary Clinton scheme. I would be saying no. I think that we as a people have a right to collect our money and say that we're not going to let anybody be without health care. And that it doesn't require private insurance companies where we all pay $80 million. You know, I mean, I'm 64 years old and I've been paying car insurance from now to doomsday. I've had one accident, which really wasn't my fault, so my insurance company never even paid that, right? So how much money have I been giving as a contribution to a private insurance company, and what has it been for? And people say, well, that's to guarantee that if you do have an accident, you'll get paid. But I know I paid more than anybody's accident over these years. So we're talking about a new scheme. But here, the scheme is that I'm the insurance guy. I made all this money from slavery, probably. Now I evolved into the insurance company in Rhode Island, where you had one of the biggest slave trades in the world, and where you have a lot of insurance companies. And so I evolved into an insurance company because I had so much money. I made money off insurance and all this stuff. So now it's in my interest to have laws that say that you have to have car insurance. Why do you have to have car insurance? What, you're going to be better off if you don't, like, if you get killed in a car wreck, like, this will make you feel better that you'll, you know what I'm trying to say? And so we have all of these laws that protect and serve the interests of a very small group of men, by the way. You know, the few 4 little women that have broken through the glass ceiling don't count, okay? They're just running another operation. The big boys are boys, okay? And they're white, and they're Protestant, mostly. But that's another conversation. So what I'm saying is the laws of this country, in the main, I don't want to break down the traffic laws because I'm scared of people running a red light, you see what I'm saying? But I know that the laws that put people in prison and criminalize people serve the interests of not the people. Some guy that rips off $20 down the street, no gun, you want to really pay $30,000 a year to keep him in prison for 10 years? I mean, what kind of, you know what I'm saying? So the laws of this country protect those people who hold the power, and in their case, it's not only guns, but it's also money. But it is guns. This country is the biggest arms supplier to all wars in the country. 85% of almost all wars have guns made in the United States. The gun manufacturers are certainly going to promote the law that says, don't forget the Constitution. We have a right to bear arms, especially if they're not Glocks, but instead Smith & Wessons. You know what I'm trying to say? This is an armed country. This is a country that doesn't play. So the arms dealers and the arms users and the people who are getting Boeing and all those companies that make money from war, their interest is to continue war. Our interest as the people is to take that $10 billion a month and put that into the hands of some children for some education, pay some teachers $150,000 a year starting salary, make sure everybody gets a health care, not health insurance. Doctors don't have to pay medical malpractice at the level so that they won't have to translate that into you. And so that is the system that we argued to take away the power from this small group and put it back into the hands of the people.
So, you're proposing, I think I understand more, you want to expand the voice of the mass.
No, and not just the voice, but the actual power. Do you understand what I mean? In other words, every single thing in this room that is here, that is tangible, material, from these lights to our clothing to this floor to this table, is manufactured and made somewhere. But most of us have no real relationship to it. We just pay. We're on the consumer wheel. We don't know why it's worth less or more. We don't know what electricity is worth. We don't even know where the power sources are. We think the power source is here. So we want to have the ability to define that and to say, I shouldn't, wait a minute, I was paying $100 a month for water and it was only costing them 2 pennies, you know what I mean?
Or $3.40 for gasoline and they made $30 billion profit.
Right. And all of these things, these day-to-day things that they're outside of our influence. And so we, like many people around the world, say, this power should not be in the hands of a few people. It should be for all of us to decide, a real democratic process, if you will. Not mob rule as we have now, we have mob rule. You know, if we in this room, I don't know how many people in the room, what do you think, 40 people, 45 people, something like that? Let's say 40 people are in this room. And so everybody votes and we say, we're gonna vote to kill me. You know what I'm saying? Now, 41 people can say, okay, and I'm dead. You understand what I'm saying? It's called mob rule. It's not democracy because it doesn't serve all of us. It just serves the group that lines up to be the majority. So if black people and white people voted in the exact same way, white people would always win. If all white people voted on this side and all black people, it's just a sheer numbers game that black people would be, as we are, sort of have a crunch. So I'm just saying, so the real democracy would be to serve the interests of the people, all of us, not a small majority who group up into a mob and are able to overwhelm the minority, right? Go ahead.
So when you came in earlier, there was some discrepancy about where the Panther Party ended, and I was just kind of wondering your opinion on where that does end or what causes it to. Well, there's a lot of things that still need to be changed, and your ideology proceeds that and says that, yeah, I mean, we should be looking to change constantly.
Well, a variety of things happened. You know, there were shifts in the party, different periods of the party, but I would say that at the end, if Ericka says 82, 81, 82, that was when the official end. But I would say officially because that was the last vestige of what we had left as an organization. The school, I would say, it can say is an institution of the Black Panther Party, and was all that we had left after the party fell into disarray in many ways. Some of that was, I would say, battle fatigue. Some of that was just people making bad decisions. The party just sort of collapsed of its own weight over the time. But you have to know that Huey Newton always said that we weren't here to institutionalize the Black Panther Party. We were here to train, to try to develop the conditions for revolution. So whether the party existed or not, as a matter of fact, when he came back from Cuba, I took over the party in Huey's absence when he went to Cuba in 1974 and came back in 1977. He was talking about disbanding the party then in terms of its name and its type. Like maybe we should be a mass organization. I have some groups that would be paying, people would be paying like $5, like the NACP paying $5 a year or something to be a member, but then there would be a core group. And so to maybe expand the party, not call it the Black Panther Party anymore. We didn't know. But we weren't really trying to institutionalize the party. But I would say that if you wanted to put a date on it, it was that when the school ended. And the reason that it ended is because Huey Newton ended up selling the school to make money for his own needs, which was a sad comment, but we can say he was the first Panther and the last in many ways. But it doesn't define the experience, it just defines the collapse and the very tragic collapse of the party. Now, there are people who will argue that the party ended when Eldridge Cleaver made an attempt in 1971 to take over the Black Panther Party's leadership. Which was quickly put down, and people like to say, well, there was a split. There was no split. A split means that half these people went with Eldridge Cleaver, and he had the other Black Panther Party, and this group had the Black. No, there was only one Black Panther Party, and then there were the people that got kicked out with Eldridge Cleaver and his wife Kathleen. But they weren't the Black Panther Party. Some of them emerged as the so-called Black Liberation Army, which is where you get the case of, for example, Assata Shakur that many of you link back to the party, or people think Mumia was a member of the party. He was a member of the party apparently for a very short period when he was about 14 or 15 years old, I think. But then when he was arrested, he had nothing to do with the Black Panther Party. So, you know, there's this kind of like, who were these people? But the party certainly survived the attempted overthrow by Eldridge Cleaver and so forth, and went on and emerged into an organization that consolidated all of our chapters into Oakland. Now there are people who were in the party who will say, well, the party was no longer a national organization. What difference did it make? You had 40-some chapters, but you only had 10 people here, 5 people there, people in prison, people spending money. So we consolidated everything into Oakland. That only made the party a stronger organization, not to say that it wasn't national, it doesn't translate into anything. But you'll have people say, well, that marked the end of the Black Panther Party when Huey Newton and the Central Committee ordered all the chapters to come into Oakland. And that people like to say, well, that's when the real Black Panther Party ended. No, the real Black Panther Party went on until 1982, even though it was small and so forth and so on. But the tenets and the structure were there. Okay, so I see that I'm getting the old hook. And listen, I want to thank all of you for listening and being interested in, I'm so happy that Ericka came, just because I haven't seen her in a while also, and I'm sure you'll really be engaged by some of the comments that she will add to this conversation in a couple of weeks. Thank you again very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.